Great. So welcome everyone. Really pleased to see you here, and also really pleased to have Nienke van Atteveldt present work with UNESCO around evidence-based education assessment lessons learned. I encourage you to all put your questions and comments in the chat. I'm sure we'll have some time at the end to talk about some of these. But I'd like to give the floor to Nienke to share some of your work.
Yes, thank you, Melanie. I will share my screen. Okay, is that visible for everyone? Yeah, so these are, my presentation is based on the slides from the UNESCO group. We presented some of the findings in November in Paris. So that was actually a real face-to-face thing, the first one again after the original meeting in 2019. As you may have been reading in the abstract, I've been co-chairing this UNESCO project, the International Science and Evidence-Based Assessment. It was originally supposed to come out yesterday. So yesterday was UNESCO's International Day of Education. But we didn't make it. So we had to postpone publication of the full report and the summary to March 20, which is the International Day of Happiness. So that's a good day as well. A lot of important days to pick from. But that's why I thought this seminar would be a nice occasion to share what we have been doing in this project. And even though you still have to wait for 2 more months for the report, I think it's still a nice occasion. So I will start today's talk with a bit of background on the project and the approach that we took. And then I will present some of the preliminary findings and overall messages. And then I will also share a little bit about the experience, like my personal experience of co-chairing this big project. Okay, so yeah. What is the ISEE Assessment? So it's an initiative by the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. So I will call that MGEP from now on. So it's a research institute from UNESCO, and it's based in New Delhi in India. And it's aimed at achieving one of the Sustainable Developmental Goals of UNESCO, the 4.71, which is to achieve education for building peaceful and sustainable societies across the world. So this research institute is aimed at that SDG. This assessment was initiated to contribute to UNESCO's bigger Futures of Education initiative, which is more of a visionary exercise. We were asked to provide the science and evidence-based input for that initiative. So basically, the ISEE assessment is an assessment of the relevant literature to feed into this Futures of Education, a project of UNESCO. So as I mentioned, the MGEP Institute is aimed at this SDG 4.7 to go towards education for more peaceful and sustainable societies across the world. And you will probably all agree that we may need some changes in the world to make this happen. So the starting point of the MGEP is that education is a key process to achieve this change. But most of the education systems we have right now, mass schooling, they were actually designed a long time ago, like 100 years ago. But today's societies, of course, face very different challenges. when comparing to that different time. Just to name a few: climate change, growing inequality, pandemics like the current one, but also increasing competition and polarization. So one of the core aims of the ISEE assessment is to answer these two very fundamental and urgent questions. The first one, are our education systems still serving the right purpose? And two, are they equipped to address the pressing challenges we face? So are they equipped to prepare future generations to make this change that we need? And I already mentioned that the ISEE assessment is a literature assessment, so it's not an assessment on student progress, like PISA, for example. And the second aim is therefore that we wanted to assess the state of knowledge on education and learning across countries through a multidisciplinary lens. And third, as I mentioned, it's supposed to provide evidence for the bigger futures of education initiative. So another aim is, with this report, that we want to strengthen the use of science and evidence in education policy making. So to show you a little bit of the process and the approach we took, this is a timeline of the project starting in September 2019 with a first expert meeting, which was, well, really the inception of the ICA. And we spent a week with a very international interdisciplinary group of experts, for example, economists, philosophers, comparative education scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists. But we also had people that have been involved in other assessments of this type, like the International Ecosystem Assessment, to advise us. So it was a very interesting week for me because it was really, yeah, a bit mind-blowing also, the scope of this project, but also of all the elements involved in education. And overall, the expert meeting was a success, I would say, although of course there were many disagreements. And also some tensions, for example, towards the role of neuroscience by the more traditional comparative education scientists. But overall, we have been able to design a conceptual framework for the assessment and started drafting a position paper. And I will show the conceptual framework in the next slide, but in this framework, we have been able to compose this huge project into smaller chunks. And to do this, we also created different working groups. And after this first meeting, the working groups started to work with each their own task and also met separately. And the first one, that was the last meeting we had in person. Actually, I didn't go there, but that was meeting by working group 2 on context. Then we are hit by the pandemic. So everything from then on was going on online. And this second workshop with the other working groups was what Melanie already mentioned. It was supposed to take place in Amsterdam, actually, supported by Learn, but then we had to go online. And I remember that was really a crazy week with meetings at crazy hours to accommodate all the time zone differences. So that was quite challenging. And then since then, we have had a lot of other meetings. And then after the working group meetings, a lot of authors have been invited. 25 chapters have been written. All these chapters have been peer reviewed. And then we are now around here. And as I mentioned, in November, we presented some of our first findings in Paris in the General Conference of UNESCO, and the full report and the summary are supposed to come out March 20. It's not 21, but 20. So this is the process. And then, as I mentioned, in this first expert meeting, we came up with a conceptual framework. So this is our attempt to show how everything is linked, and also to be able to work like in smaller groups to make it a little bit more digestible. So the first box that you see here is taken care of by the first working group also on the goals of education. And the alignment of these goals with today's needs. And we placed human flourishing at the center of education and learning in the ISEE assessment as a benchmark to evaluate if education has contributed to the betterment of society. So that's what you see in this first box. And then, by the way, do you see my mouse or not? Okay. Then the second and the third box, they show the context, all the different contextual factors that in which education is embedded, but also that contribute to shaping education. And then in this second box are the more macro context factors, the societal and environmental context. And this third box over here is the more education specific context, the policies and practices. And then we have this fourth box, which is concerned with assessing the most recent insights in the learning experience. So this was also a working group that was focused mostly on the learning sciences, including also neuroscience, to assess what, how, where, and when we learn or should learn. For example, what we learn, whether it's mostly focused on the cognitive or knowledge acquisition aspect, or also the more social and emotional dimensions, and so on. And this learning experience was assessed against the benchmarks of the pillars of education that are defined also by UNESCO a while ago: learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and learning to live together. Yeah, so this is the conceptual framework, and we published this in a position paper in the Nature Partner Journal Science of Learning. So if you want to read more about it, you can find it there. And as I mentioned, based on this conceptual framework, we structured the assessment initially in 3 working groups. So the one on human flourishing, one on context, one on the learning experience. And then later we also initiated a 4th one on data and evidence. And this was because already during this first expert meeting, we noticed that the terms evidence and data were not clear at all actually across disciplines. So we needed to dive into that separately. And this is an overview of all the people involved. So we have an advisory board, which includes policymakers, education practitioners, etc. Then we had 2 assessment co-chairs, which is me and the MDiep director, Ananta Durayappa. And then this was actually one of the advantages of having to cancel a lot of the live meetings, that there was apparently a lot of money left. So we were able to hire research fellows, and that has been really great for the project. And one of these research fellows is someone we know, is Marieke Bijl, and she's also here today. So she has been she has played an important role so in this project. And it was really a pleasure to work with her on this. So we had these 4 working groups, and each of the working groups were also led by 2 or 3 co-chairs. And we really chose these to represent different disciplines, to prevent that people would still be like working within their own like group of usual suspects in inviting authors and etc. We really wanted to combine scientific bubbles that haven't been combined before. And these working group co-chairs then assembled teams of authors, among which we also have some familiar names. For example, Elsje van Bergen has been one of the authors, and also the former Learn director Dorette Ruiter has been involved. And then very importantly, we had an independent review system. So all the chapters have been peer reviewed by peer scientists. And this is a different way to show all the people. This is on the project website. It's a very nice Kumu map. Of course, this is a static screenshot, but if you would like to explore a bit, you can go to the ISEE website. And this gives an idea of the huge amount of people involved. So here you see me and Ananta, and I don't know why Marieke, they made her so small, but she's been working mainly with us. So we have been working a lot with the three of us. And then here you see the different working groups with the co-chairs, and here the independent review groups and the advisory board. Okay, so these were the aims in terms of the outcomes of the assessment. So one aim was to share scientifically robust, evidence-based, relevant and inclusive knowledge on education, to contribute to UNESCO's Futures of Education initiative, to promote multidisciplinary dialogue and research in education, to provide policy relevant information and recommendation, and to identify information gaps and priorities for future research. Now, the more concrete outputs of the assessment are, first of all, the full report. So the full report is quite huge, actually. It's a report of 25 chapters. And this is just to give you an idea of the scope of the topics included. So this first working group has produced 5 chapters on flourishing in relation to education, and also the scientific basis of flourishing in development. And the second working group has produced 10 chapters about all the different contextual factors in which education is embedded. So political economy, but also conflicts, assessments, teachers, sustainability, so a lot of different topics. And then the third working group about the learning experience has covered everything related to learning, from brain development maturation, learning disabilities to learning spaces. And then this fourth working group on data and evidence has produced 3 chapters to provide more clarity and guidance on what evidence actually means and on how data can and should be used in education policy making. So that's the full report. And a very important other output is the summary for decision makers. And this is important because we don't really expect policymakers to read the full 25 chapter report. So in this summary for decision makers, we try to get to the core of the findings and in a way that it's digestible and makes it clear what are the really important messages of our assessment. Just to mention her again, this is where Marieke Bijl also really contributed to. So Marieke and me and Ananta have been the main authors of this summary for decision makers. And very importantly, this SDM is actually not meant as a summary, but as a synthesis document. And to achieve this, we worked as follows. We came up with 5 key questions. So these are questions that are key for the whole assessment. And then we went into all the different chapters to answer these questions. So this is how we combined all the different findings from the different working groups in a synthesized way. So the 5 questions we answer in this SDM are, the first one is, has education evolved over the past 50 years for the betterment of society? The second question is, how has context shaped educational policies and practices over the past 50 years? The third question was, how has context, together with these policies and practices, influenced the what, how, where, and when we learn? And then the fourth question is how, well, based on all these findings, how can education be reimagined to maximize human flourishing? And the fifth question is, which gaps should be addressed in future research? So under each of these 5 questions, we drafted several, actually quite many key findings. So that is really too much to present now, but I will present a selection just to give you an idea of what kind of findings we came up with. So related to this first key question, one of the findings was that despite advancements in some segments across the world, education policies have unintentionally exacerbated inequality, establishing new forms of elitism and a mindset focused on individualism. And then this figure is an example of how we used data and evidence to come to such a finding. So if you look at this figure, you see that for some of the education targets, things have certainly improved. So rates of literacy, numeracy, enrollment in education, they have improved, but other elements of education, and especially the ones that are like needed for developing human flourishing, have been the ones that actually have decreased. So related to agency, but also to the more relational aspects, social aspects. So, and because of that, we conclude that actually it hasn't been that great for in terms of equality and social relations. Yeah. Another key findings that I wanted to illustrate is that mostly based on the conclusions from the third working group about the learning experience, one of their main conclusions is actually that they show how densely interactive the development of the cognitive, metacognitive, and social emotional functions is. So this finding emphasizes that it's important to foster a symbiotic relationship between these functions, so that cognitive, metacognitive, social, emotional functions should be simultaneously nurtured in education. And this is what we started to call a whole brain approach in the SDM, but I will tell more about that later. And as you may notice in this figure, we also found that these pillars of education that UNESCO published a while ago probably needs some extensions. So we extended them by adding learning to think, learning to become, and learning to live with nature. And to achieve these 7 pillars, the finding is that we need to foster this symbiotic relationship between different aspects of learning. These are a couple of findings related to the 4th key question on reimagining education for human flourishing. Finding 3 is that we find that the current focus on summative and static testing does not seem to be optimal towards flourishing, and that a shift is needed towards more formative and dynamic learner assessments, encouraging continuous feedback to acknowledge learning potentiality. So it's more focused on potential and growth of a learner rather than absolute achievements. And the 4th finding related to inclusive education, that there have been a lot of inclusive education policies, but they don't seem to be very effective so far. So we suggest that there should be investments in especially preventive screening of at-risk learners, but also in teacher training, that teachers understand better what individual differences and to reduce bias, and also in educational technology, as digital technologies have been found to especially be effective in supporting children with special needs. And the 5th finding is about educational technology. And we find that it shows promise to provide a personalized learning experience, but that it's also very important that they are being ethically implemented. So we have to, for example, take into account the possible negative sides, the digital divide, for example, privacy issues. So it should really be a combination of a good ethical implementation to get to these opportunities. And as I mentioned, we have many more key findings, which will be published in the SDM. Because these key findings in the end were quite many, we also drafted several key take-home messages with which we will probably start the SDM. So to make clear right from the start what we think policymakers should really take home from our report. And the first one is, for example, that every learner learns differently and is influenced by a complex combination of internal as well as external context factors. And that's why receiving a personalized learning experience is important, but especially this realization that every learner is very different is very important. And then the second take-home message is related to what I mentioned before, this like interactive development of social, emotional, and cognitive and more metacognitive functions. So we call that a whole brain learner approach is necessary, so that all these different functions are simultaneously nurtured and not in isolation. And another important message is that context plays a huge role in the design and implementation of education. But maybe that's more of a wish, but that's what we hope to achieve, that over time, if we are able to implement some elements that improve education for flourishing, that this will also influence context, so that it can lead to an upward spiral towards, well, what we of course in the end hope to achieve, more sustainable and peaceful societies across the world. Well, we have a couple more. Learner agency, that's very important to promote. And then the fifth one is related to the finding about learner assessment. that I mentioned, that we recommend to shift more towards dynamic formative assessments. So the take-home message is to replace meritocracy by a potentiality. So that's a more philosophical term, but that's a better starting point to reach flourishing, because it's much more focused on an individual's own rate of learning and a personal learning trajectory, and compatible with these dynamic and formative learner assessments. Well, that investment in education is needed, but that it should be directed towards this whole brain and learner-centric system. And the last one is also very important. It's that that interdisciplinary dialogue, research, and collaboration is very important. And this is what we have been doing in this project. So we realized even more how important it is, but and that it's very challenging, so that it should really be supported. And then we also have in the SCM policy recommendations, and they're all based on these messages and findings. So I just wanted to give some examples to show you how they are aligned. So based on this idea of the interactive development of cognition, metacognition, etc., then we recommend that curricula, pedagogies, and learner assessments should be designed towards this whole brain learner-centric approach. And related to the learner assessment and potentiality, the recommendation would be to replace credentialism and meritocracy with potentiality, so a different focus on what is important. Related to this inclusive education, to focus more on prevention, and related to, as I mentioned before, the importance of teacher training, that teacher flourishing is also an important goal to achieve, and teacher training is part of that, but also recognizing the importance of the profession, etc. And the last one I wanted to mention here is that we also recommend to reorganize research funding, which is a relevant one for us, because we acknowledge that it's so important to support this interdisciplinary dialogue and research, but it is very challenging. And one of the reasons why it's challenging is because it's also hard to find funding for these really large-scale global research programs. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to share about the project and what we found, and how we will like communicate to policymakers what we think is important. I also wanted to reflect a little bit on the experience of co-leading this quite big project, as I clearly didn't really know what I was getting into beforehand. So I was very interested to participate, because I always already think that it's so important to collaborate, to combine like perspectives and pieces of knowledge. But that once again, this project is really shown also how difficult it is, right? I think everyone would agree that it's really important to work in interdisciplinary teams, but it's definitely easier said than done. So we recently actually have been joking that we should have hired an ethnographer to study the social process of this whole collaboration. And I think, yeah, what has been so challenging is that we really challenged authors and co-chairs to get out of their comfort zone of their own group of people that they usually work with. And we did lose some authors because in the end they weren't comfortable enough to really co-author a chapter with people from a really different perspective. And I think that here, if we would have been able to meet face to face, that would have helped, definitely. I also at some point had this kind of meta experience that when I realized that what we are talking about in the report, in the project, right, that we discussed that we think children need to learn different things in this changing world, like communication skills, listening to each other, interacting with others and other perspectives without feeling threatened. And that actually is exactly what we also need as scientists to be able to work together across disciplines. And I also wrote more about this idea in a blog that you can find here using this link. But basically, the message is that we should practice what we preach, and that we in interdisciplinary teams, that it's so important to listen to each other and to be open to learn from each other and to ask questions, because so often we had whole discussions and then it turned out we were talking completely about different things while using the same term, for example. And that could have been avoided if someone right at the start had just asked, yeah, what exactly do you mean with that? But then I guess people don't do that because they're afraid that they are supposed to know, or I don't know. Just some observations of things that I myself might also do differently next time. So that's what I wanted to tell you.